Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Webinars and Conversation Cafe series. My name is Sylvia Di Blas. I'm one of the co-coordinators for the Reconnects network. Thank you for joining us for the Webinars and Cafes Conversation series, where we are offering a wide range of rich educational and supportive opportunities for our global community of the Reconnects facilitators, members, and friends of the network. Our intention is to strengthen the web of the World Reconnects community while continually reaching beyond our current edges to weave deeper connections with others who are contributing to the great turning in diverse and complementary ways. And today we are presenting to you Systems Thinking, Systems Doing, and Systems Being with Felicia Chavez, who alongside with me is an alumnus of the Capra course, Thinking in Systems, and also a specialist in systems. Felicia, take it away. Can you introduce yourself?
Great. Well, gosh, I'm very honored to be here. Thank you, Sylvia, and the Work That Reconnects group for the invitation. So my name is Felicia Chavez. I am currently temporarily located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania today. And I, up until September of last year, was in the San Francisco Bay Area, starting in 1995, where I moved from further north. The Grass Valley, Nevada City area is where I hail from originally. And yeah, I think by way of introduction, I'll just mention that I came into the world of systems thinking in the Green MBA program. It doesn't exist anymore. It was previously through New College of California. Some of you might be familiar with New College. And I did that program, the Green MBA, 2005 to 2007. We had our campus up in the Sonoma County area. And that was with Jane Lorand and John Staten, the co-founders of that program. And at that time, Jane brought in Bruce McKenzie, who is a phenomenal systems thinker person. The phrase he uses is systemics for the work that he does. He's based out of Australia. And so I was introduced to systems thinking in kind of more of an organizational development context and community organizing. And it wasn't until many years later, I was doing a PhD in mythological studies at Pacifica Graduate Institute, where when I started to sort of look at my dissertation topic, I thought that bringing in the systems worldview would be helpful. And it just so happened 2016 was the year that Fritjof Capra and Pierluigi Luisi published their textbook, The Systems View of Life. And then I had a course a year later, and that's the course that Sylvia mentioned earlier. So I am going to go ahead and dive into the presentation portion of today. Okay, so I'm going to move into presentation mode here on my slides. So this is systems thinking, systems doing, and systems being, and we'll have some examples of each of those for the Work That Reconnects network, February 25th, 2023. So the brief outline for today is Roman numeral 1, looking at systems thinking, doing, and being. 2, what is a system? 3, images, exercise, and feedback. 4, how do I know if an approach to helping the world is a systems versus a linear or conventional approach? And we have 3 pieces to that: a 3-tier model, A, B, and C guides, and example. And we're not going to do this breakout group, but we will have a brief bit of discussion via the chat. And then a case study, and we will do this breakout group with discussion and feedback, and then a summary and conclusion. So we're starting with this systems thinking. So for example, as I mentioned, organizational development and community organizing. But for those of you who are familiar with the world of systems thinking, you also know that in terms of the literature itself, there's an early origin in the world of cybernetics and some of these other fancy sciences that personally I am not acquainted with. And then also ecological sciences. And so even just from this short list, you realize this is not a field. Systems thinking is not a discipline or field of practice on the whole. Rather, it's a worldview. It's bigger than what we might call a field, because it enters into this great variety of disciplines. A few examples of systems doing: permaculture, high quality project-based learning, restorative justice. And as we go through the presentation today, if you're familiar with any of these areas and more, you might start to think, oh, I see how that might connect with why Felicia would say permaculture is a systems thinking approach, or high quality project-based learning, or restorative justice. Or another example is empowerment of women and girls, and empowerment often being defined as both access to quality education through secondary school and access to family planning services. Now, when it comes to systems being, I didn't make a sort of list of examples, but rather, I'm just going to say very broadly that systems being we could look at as direct experience of interconnectedness. And so that might be an experience that you come through the rational mind of understanding a panoply of factors. It might be psychedelics. It might be, you had a psychedelic experience with the help of some substances, and you had this opening in your consciousness, and you had this profound experience, or maybe not so profound, but nevertheless an experience of the reality of interconnectedness. It might be through a mystical tradition. It might be through just a moment that you can't necessarily name or put a label on, but nevertheless, you had a real experience of interconnectedness. And I'll just take a moment here to say that for me, ultimately, this whole world of systems thinking is, for me, ultimately about the evolution of human consciousness. And therefore, underneath it all, there is this spiritual impulse for me personally. And I've seen that, of course, across other teachers and models, etc. So just to look at this question as we are at the beginning here, what is a system? And Sylvia helpfully pointed out that I should maybe look at this. Now, I'm not going to go into extensive definition. We're going to keep this very brief and very general, just to kind of keep the box as open as possible. So we're looking here at an image, and the mind, the human mind, we see something and tend to want to let's see, what's the phrase? Pattern recognition. We want to see, oh, what's happening there? Like there's this natural impulse we have to see patterns, pattern making. And if we just sort of look at this, you might, with your mind, sort of see some kind of pattern or something. But for me, I kind of have to bring in a little bit of something else to start to see that maybe these different elements represented by these different colored shapes, maybe there is a system here. Maybe they are in relationship to each other. Maybe that big blue one is rolling downhill. Maybe they are sort of in relationship to one another in terms of how far apart they are. Maybe there's movement here. And so there's just this kind of natural impulse and I think we have to see patterns, to see relationships between the elements. And we'll see throughout this presentation that relationships is a recurring theme. So we're going to do this brief experiential exercise where I'm going to show you some images, and I'm asking you to note your internal state. So this does require, I like this line from Eckhart Tolle, be at least as interested in what's happening inside as in what's happening outside. So this is the official request to attend to what's happening inside of yourself as you look at these images. And there are 6 images total. I'll go through them one at a time. And then a brief review. So again, the suggestion is to notice at that before thought level, very subtle level, how you respond internally to something. And then I'd like to ask you now, if you're able to interact with your chat box, to put a couple thoughts in the chat. And while you do that, I will go back to just these 2 slides of the sort of summary piece, which was these 3. And these 3. Okay. So looking for somebody to give us some feedback. Okay, a stirring. Somebody has the same speaker. Hard then soft, made me smile. Underlying emotion, tranquility, static, and then alive. Yeah, yes. So yeah, and so for me, I'll just share my experience since I'm speaking. So let me figure out how to move my slides back here. So for me, when I put these different images together, I noticed when I was looking at these, sorry, it's going forward all by itself here. When I was looking at sort of these static images, someone used that word static, I just didn't get a whole lot coming up. Now, if I had an association with some of these, which in fact, this one here, this is a lamp from IKEA that's meant to look like a kerosene lamp. I grew up with kerosene lamps. When I was quite young, we had kerosene lamps in our house. So I might, if I recognize that, it might bring up an association. But then it's not until I get to these guys where I feel myself start to project consciousness. Whether it's there or not, I kind of want it to be there. And again, it's kind of like going back to that image with the shapes. It's that like pattern seeking, sort of looking for something. Maybe something's there. Maybe something's there. Like that kind of almost hopeful sort of feeling. And let's see. Okay, I'm just glancing at the chat box again real quick. Yeah, texture. Yes, and somebody used the word recognizable. And I would say that's really key. There's this moment of recognition. There's 2 eyes. There's a nose and a mouth, depending on the level of amphibianness of the frog, or the toad. There's this, there's something. Okay, so moving along. Thank you for your feedback. So this is the next question we're looking at. How do I know if an approach to helping the world is a, quote, systems versus a linear or conventional approach? And we're going to use terms like right and wrong in this presentation. But before we do, I just want to say we're using those terms for illustration purposes. So ultimately, we don't want to throw out the linear conventional approach. Rather, we want to expand the palette of tools and worldviews we have access to. And as we see going forward, we want them all to work together rather than excising one set of tools in favor of another. We want to just bring in more tools. So what this model is showing us here is meant to represent the world of NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And I've formatted this with charitable at the top, advocacy in the middle, and systems at the bottom. Now, I put it in this way because I'm suggesting that systems underlies everything else, and that in some way the sort of advocacy space underlies the charitable space. The charitable meaning direct service, short-term, immediate help. The advocacy being a bit more medium-term. You're lobbying for the well-being of something or someone or a group or a landscape or an issue you care about. And then the systems being the long-term, the question of sustainability. What is the background against which advocacy and charitable approaches take place? And so the ideal from my perspective as a proponent of systems thinking, is that the advocacy and the charitable space are infused with the systems view. So rather than the charitable approach happening in isolation or the advocacy approach happening in isolation, rather the systems worldview has informed whatever actions we take to advocate for something and whatever charitable direct service we provide for whatever group or cause. And so to get more specific about how to differentiate, I've got these this sort of set of things I'm going to present to you now. This is shifting your default perspective from the short term to the long term, from narrow to wide, and from surface or shallow to deep. And we might read in sort of value judgments when we use words like narrow or shallow. And on the one hand, that's okay, that's going to come up. And on the other, we don't want to get too fixed about the right and wrongness. We want to use right and wrong, narrow, shallow for illustrative purposes, but be able to set that value judgment aside also. And B, it's about relationships. And just so you know, we're going to have some examples related to these, but it's about when you're trying to shift into the worldview of systems, you start to see how primary relationships of all kinds are. So that might be the relationship between me and my computer. Is it becoming like a parasite where it's like sucking my attention and my energy and I feel tired after X amount of time using it? Or do I feel like I'm able to kind of have this sort of give and take and ability to step away from it rather than feeling like I'm absorbed by it? It's, of course, relationships between people, between me and friends, family, coworkers, etc., between different groups of people, between humans and other species, between different other species, between what we think of as living and what we think of as inert or inanimate matter, between abstract principles even. But in the world of systems thinking, I'm sure if you're familiar with it, you can see how relationships come up again and again and again. And then the ability to hold the one and the many at the same time. And so my fun example of this is an astrological natal chart. And for those of you who may not be familiar, it's if you think of a wheel or a clock, and you're saying, oh, the sun is kind of in the upper right, but then Saturn's in sort of the lower left, and they have this opposition to each other. But but the sun is in the I guess that would be like the 7th house, and Saturn is in the 1st house. So, so it's like you're building up these multiple layers of potential meaning, and you're sort of starting to hold them all. Also with an ecosystem, if you're looking at a bumblebee and a particular type of plant and the weather and the neighbors, the human settlement, you're starting to kind of build up these different layers, this multiplicity of factors that interact. So that goes back to relationships, but it also is this developed skill over time, the ability to hold the one and the many kind of at the same time. I mean, not exactly at the same time, but nevertheless, this bringing into the space multiplicity. So for an example, we're going to very briefly look at the criminal justice system. And let's see here. So starting with the conventional criminal justice system, we might think of Law and Order or, other things we've seen on television, or we might, you might be an attorney, or you might have been through the criminal justice system yourself. But in any case, I am going to propose that it tends to be, as we see here on the left, short-term fix-oriented, narrow in scope, and focused on fulfilling the letter of the law. You may very well have a different perspective, and we'll ask for a moment in your chat box to share any feedback, thoughts you have. But generally speaking, on the right, the restorative justice system has more of a long-term restoration approach, tends to be quite wide in scope. So some of you might be familiar with the world of restorative justice, but it's very much about like looking at the web of relationships and a whole lot of different factors all put together in what it addresses. and focused on healing. So again, just to recap, I'm contrasting these two very, very general approaches using very general language: conventional, short-term, restorative, long-term; conventional, narrow in scope, restorative, wide in scope; and conventional, focused on fulfilling the letter of the law, and restorative, focused on healing. Now, it turns out it's not just me with this sort of a general take on these two different ways of attending to the justice system. This is from Howard Zehr on a Wikipedia page, and I copied and pasted this language that's on the Wikipedia page from Howard Zehr. So he says, conventional on the left: what laws have been broken? Who did it? And what do the offenders deserve? And on the right, restorative asks, who has been hurt? What are their needs? Whose obligations are these? What are the causes? Who has a stake in the situation? What is the appropriate process to involve stakeholders in an effort to address causes and put things right? So you can see from this language, even just the density of words, that the conventional approach, there's fewer words. And the restorative approach, it's more dense in terms of its language. It's more complex. And of course, this world of complexity comes along with the system's worldview. So we're moving into our case study, and it will take us a little bit to get there before we get to the actual breakout groups. But this case studies, the purpose of it is to ask you as a participant to gain experience applying the 3-tier model, which is that cake that we looked at: charitable, advocacy, and systems. So using your words, your sentences, engaging your mind with that 3-tier model, and the above criteria that we just have reviewed: the short to long-term, relationships, and the ability to hold the one and the many, and applying those to a specific challenge. And we're going to supply you with what that specific challenge is. It's an imaginary organization. It's called Road Safety for Animals of America. And you, as a participant in the case study breakout group, is to imagine that you are responsible for strategy. You are co-responsible for strategy along with your other group participants. And so we're asking for the first part of the breakout group to do it, quote unquote, wrong. And again, I'm using this language to help clarify the breakout group exercise. So that means if you are the Road Safety for Animals of America person responsible for strategy, and you're thinking about the charitable and advocacy activities you might carry out as this organization's, think about what you might do setting aside the systems view. So charitable in isolation and advocacy activities in isolation. And this is my little, just kind of review of the charitable advocacy, and then the systems will come in the second part of it. So that means doing it right, informing the charitable and advocacy activities that you might imagine you would undertake with the systems view. So that's where we actually, I guess I needed to skip ahead to this one where they're all purple. So the first part is that model where the charitable and the advocacy are separate and done in isolation. And then the second part of the exercise is having a conversation where the systems view informs your charitable and your advocacy activities. And just a brief review of what differentiates those two parts of the exercise, the quote unquote wrong and the quote unquote right, is in the latter part, we want you to think about the long-term, wide, and deep approach to charitable and advocacy activities within your group. And also think about relationships, putting relationships first in whatever those, whatever your strategy might be for your organization. And then this ability to hold the one and the many, exercising that skill in the context. And then we will come back and have a round of feedback. So I've just stopped sharing my screen to enable us to move into our groups.
Thank you, Felicia. And before we move into the groups, and Joe is preparing the groups right now. So a reminder, if you are not able or don't want to get into a group, put out number 1 before your name. And also, if you have questions about the exercises, something was not clear about what you're going to be doing, you can raise your hand by going into reaction and raise the hand. We will have a time for questions about the topic itself after the break, after the breakout rooms. But for now, the questions that I'm inviting is only if you have doubts about how the exercise is going to be done in the breakout rooms. Helen, you have a question?
How long do we have?
Yeah, that's very important. Felicia, can you give the time, approximate time? And we're going to
15
have
minutes.
prompts, 15 minutes in total. So you, the suggestion is you as a group self-organize to work on the first option for about 7 minutes and another, 7 minutes for the second option, which is the systemic approach. So you will have around 1 minute to self-organize how you're going to be doing that in your group. Is that correct, Felicia?
Yeah. I'm just sorry. I was just noticing somebody put in the chat, no group, please. So I would suggest if you're not able to add a 1 before your name so that Joe can easily exclude you, maybe just drop off the call for the next 5 minutes and then rejoin us, because I don't want Joe to have to pick out individual names because there's a lot of people gathered.
I got that
Thank
one.
you.
Though. It's okay.
Thank you. Okay, so let us know when you're ready for these to go, Joe. I don't see any more questions.
Okay. I'm pretty ready. We've got groups between 2 and 4 people. So some
Perfect.
groups are going to be a little bit bigger than others.
Perfect. And I'm going to post the recording for now. Okay, and we're recording again. And welcome back, everybody, from the rooms and the exercises. I hope that you enjoyed the time together and was fruitful. And we will start making some connections between these concepts and the work that reconnects and the work that we do at the work that reconnects. But before that, I would like to invite, a couple of questions from groups, a couple of insights that you may have. And if needed, Felicia can also provide some examples. I remember that, some of the groups were asking for specific examples of the charity model versus, the other models. So if you have a question or you want to share an insight from your group, just go to reactions on the bottom of your screen and you can press your hand so we can see you. Okay, Michelle.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, likewise. I was excited when you were going to be on this. So some of the things that we talked about in the kind of direct charitable model is that example of people who were kind of like actively helping salamanders migrate across a road during breeding season or something like that for a couple of weeks as being the sort of direct, simple, fix the problem right there. And then a more systems approaches we talked about were things like road closures or speed regulators on vehicles or having the vehicles make some kind of sound that's audible to the animals at night when those migrations would be happening so that they're much less likely to have cars collide with them.
Interesting. Yeah. So I participated in one of the breakouts, and I'm interested to hear from others too. Thank you, Michelle. And one thing I wanted to point out is that when we move from, and I'm sure you can relate to this, Michelle, as well, when we move from the sort of linear conventional approach to the systems view, part of what happens in that movement is that we're moving from quote unquote fixing a problem to engaging with an attempt to improve a situation, like would be one very general way of putting it. And so even if we're doing something like, lowering road speed limits, for example, as Jerry, who I met with in the breakout room, was pointing out, like, who's to say somebody isn't going to come along and change that in, 5 years or something to that effect. And so there's a gradation here. There's in terms of how much have we moved out of the sort of conventional fix-it approach into more of the long-term sustainable or even regenerative, much more systems-y view and approach to improving conditions that we know could change again tomorrow.
Mhm.
And so yeah, there's more there to unpack, but I think those are good examples. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that. And also, and this is a bigger discussion that is not on the scope of this webinar, but if you start thinking about the leverage points in the system, to change the system, another way to see that is if you change the whole paradigm about how you see animals and roads and the use of cars, then it's an even more, powerful and systemic change, because it's at the level of the paradigm change. So anyways, I saw another hand. I think it was Albert. Albert, do you have a question or an insight? You can unmute yourself.
Yes,
Perfect.
yes. So a systems approach, I live in the land of lots of wildlife in upper Minnesota. And so public transportation, I think that was kind of talked about, and understanding the needs of the insects, which becomes even more complicated than salamanders, understanding when they're mating and having a day off in the transit system, even just knowing that that's important, because insects are drastically important, and so but so it's education. It's the highest order of it, just moving towards the whole community having an understanding what that process is and providing a functional alternatives, public transit, that doesn't run when the insects are mating.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that piece about public transit is really interesting too, because it actually makes me think about a kind of, I don't know, data point, for lack of a better term, that has to do with, it turns out that studies show that in areas with bike infrastructure, and I'm not an expert in this area, but I know that does look like delineated, well-marked lanes and these sorts of things. Women are more likely to use bicycles as a form of transit than in areas that lack that infrastructure. And this pertains directly to our topic, or maybe a little bit indirectly, but nevertheless, that overall sense of safety and just kind of feeling good about being on the road. And when these factors are attended to, it has, goes well beyond the safety of animals and wildlife on the road. And so the public transit's a perfect example. I mean, the more we're taking public transit, then the fewer the cars on the road. Also, though, I just wanted to kind of go back to Michelle's mention about the salamanders, for example, though, because like in the systems view, it's if you're going to run out there and move the salamanders off the road, you're going to want to make sure that you've kind of looked at the situation. Now, maybe not. Maybe, I mean, if it were me, honestly, if I saw a salamander on the road and a car coming, I'm likely to run out there, not to put myself in danger, in a safe way, but nevertheless. However, in this sort of systems view, you'd want to make sure that by doing so, you're not depriving some other animal species that's become dependent on the dead salamanders on the road. You know, like you've got to kind of widen out that view. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of make that point.
Yeah, and that came, to the relationships, to start thinking on even beyond human safety and beyond the human way to see things. I see some other hands, and I would like to take those. So I see J or G. I don't know how to pronounce the name. Go ahead.
It's Jay. Yeah, so I couldn't remember exactly what the organization was, but in my head I said like roadkill. And so I was like, well, humans are another form of animal and they get hit by cars too. So thinking about the current challenges with the city, I'm in Portland, and the rate of people getting hit by cars and dying by cars is skyrocketing. And there's one intersection in particular where cars are always just, running the red light, running the stops, and really hurting people. And rather than deal with the cars, they just closed those sidewalks, they closed those crosswalks. And so I was like, the short-term approach for this would be to just close everything, no animal crossing signs everywhere, and big X's, and banning people and finding people if they like have their dogs off leash and have their animals out and about. And so like sort of trying to restrict the motion of the animals themselves, I feel like would be the short-term solution, because that's kind of what they do right now with car accidents. They try and just restrict the motion of the people rather than building an infrastructure that will make everybody safer. And it made me think of the systems approach. I immediately went to the sort of like warehouseization of our economy, right? The Amazons, the Walmarts. And first of all, they take up huge ecosystems up. These ecosystems are destroyed to create these massive things, and then the animals are pushed off their land. And then once that happens, and people too, obviously. And so these animals and people are displaced, and so they're more likely to be in places maybe that are not the safest for them. And also the trucks, thinking about what is running over the creatures, if it's a bike, usually not a walking person, usually a smaller car could probably stop in time, but a big SUV, a truck, especially a truck on a deadline, on an Amazon deadline, is not stopping for no animal. And I thought about that as we had this huge freak blizzard that that paralyzed our highways. And I just want everyone to look at the amount of trucks that are stuck outside of Portland right now, that have been stuck there for over a day. And that is, what is destroying whole ecosystems. And so that was kind of my systems approach, was degrowth, depaving, breaking up all of these capitalist enterprises, nationalizing everything. So that would be like my solution. Thanks.
Yeah. And that's to clarify, Jay, that's a bigger long-term solution that is more complex and involves so many more other things. So when Felicia was saying right and wrong, be careful with those words, is sometimes you have to go to the linear just to save something from happening right there that is in front of you, and that's the more linear charitable approach. And it has to be done. Like sometimes somebody is is being killed, you have to do something right away. And then there's also that systemic view that is changing absolutely everything, and how we go from that to that, to the other extreme. And that's something that we are going to be exploring in the second part. So thank you for bringing that up, because that's so important. I see two more hands, and we're going to take two more questions or insights, and then we're going to go for a break. Lloyd, go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Sylvia. Felicia, in your presentation, you didn't differentiate between living systems and engineered systems. And I think there's a big difference in approaches there. And when you're even in an engineered systems, part of that is a living system as it gets applied in the world. So that gives us more things to think about. And we talked about some of the issues that come up. And one is that in our political system and our philosophy, we're trying to control things. And so our short-term approaches are almost always about trying to control what's going on there, which limits so much what can happen. And let's see. And another thing came up in our discussion is that instead of trying to come up with a solution, to recognize that you're part of an ongoing process, and that seeing it as a process, you're going to need to continually measure the results and respond to what is happening based upon the actions that you've taken. So it becomes, rather than a solution, it becomes an ongoing process.
Absolutely, for
Yeah.
sure.
Thank you, Lloyd. And that's actually connecting to the, to the 12 points of leverage, in the system, or to change the system, that, one of them is to have clear, transparent information and to measure things. So you can inform and, and create changes, inform in real information and, clear information, and not in misleading information. But that's another point. But thank you for that. And Helen, I see your hand on.
This is only partly to do with animals on roads. I'm from South Africa, and we've had problems with baboons, which are big animals and quite fierce, very strong, move-in troops. They've been moved as housing has expanded. Their feeding grounds have been impacted, and they've moved into houses very aggressively, attacking and killing dogs and looking for food. Part of what attracts them is the sort of waste food that's put into people's bins for collection. And they've been a problem for a long time. They've been shot at, they've been, all kinds of things they've attempted to get rid of them. And recently, a man came up with such an elegant solution. And it seems to me that systems provide a kind of win-win solution for everybody involved in it. And what he's persuaded all the restaurants and the people living in that area is to collect their waste, their waste food, to be collected by the pig farmers every day. So that the pig farmers collect the waste food. There's nothing that attracts the baboons anymore. They've gone back into the mountains. The pig farmers benefit because it saved them huge amounts in pig food, and the pigs are very happy. Everybody wins. And that seems to me a systemic solution to what has been a linear problem for a very long time. Is it true then that system solutions are kind of win-win solutions?
Yeah, I mean, I always hold these, kind of pat phrases like best practices and, all that a little bit in perspective. And so I think I do that a little bit with the win-win.
Mm.
But I would agree that generally speaking, you kind of have, it's kind of like, I don't know if any of you, I'm sure some of you have done dream work before, where you have a conversation about a dream and somebody says something that sparks an interior aha. And sometimes it's not even an aha about your dream, it's an aha about somebody else's dream. But in any case, it's like that, And so what you just shared about the collection of the food scraps for the pig farms, like, I feel like a lot of us probably went, kind of had that aha. And so I think that kind of echoes that idea of a win-win. And again, not wanting to get caught in that phrase, but also it's useful, kind of like these right and wrong terms. It's useful to be like, that you feel a felt sense of the pieces connecting rather than that snarled sense of like what are we gonna do? Like when you described the baboon situation, I was like, oh Lordy, what do we do about the baboons?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So thank you for that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and thank you because that also exemplifies, bringing, the more relationships and considering the more, peoples and beings involved in this situation. So, okay, so I see one question. We're a little bit over the hour. So Harriet, yours is going to be the last intervention before we go for a break. And then we will open up for a little bit more conversation and questions about how we actually implement these for systems change, in our own lives, in the activism that we are involved in our own lives and, families and communities, organizations, etc. Harriet, go ahead.
Well, I was thinking if we were looking for long-term solutions, and what would be a paradigm shifting idea would be to get the cars and the trucks off the roads so that the animals had a little bit of leeway. And we'd also be solving climate change and global warming by reducing the use of fossil fuels. So if you really took a big picture look at it, you'd say, let's stop using cars and let's use bicycles, walking, which is much healthier, and public transit, and be building houses in the future where people could walk to work. And we'd reduce shipping food, pineapples from Hawaii, we'd be eating locally grown food. We could be creating resilient communities that were self-reliant in terms of food production. So we didn't need all those cars on the road. We'd be eating local food, fresh, organic, healthy foods. The animals would be protected because we wouldn't have highways with cars and trucks and diesels, going fast. And we'd be creating a habitat, an environment that was good for animals, good for people, and good for protection of the planet from global warming. A simple paradigm shift, easier to say than to do.
Yes, yeah, no, great point, Harriet. And it's like you can almost kind of feel how, the sort of on the periphery that's like, but what about the economy? But what about all those people with their jobs at the supermarket? But what about, and that gets to this question of purpose. And, Sylvia mentioned earlier the leverage points to intervene in a system from Danella Meadows. And so this really kind of gets into that territory of like, well, what's the purpose? What's the purpose of life? What's the purpose of our civilization? What's the purpose of our town? And it's like, well, if the purpose is profit and growth and commerce, then you get what we kind of have right now. But if the purpose is well-being, you have a picture that looks much similar to the one you just painted,
enhancing life enhancing solutions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. So when we come back, we're gonna start putting everything together and aligning this to the work of Reconnects, the work that we do as an activist and, people who actually want to change systems. So we are going to take a break of 5 minutes as a bio break. You don't have to leave the call. You can just shut down your camera, make sure that you are muted, and just come back in 5 minutes, wherever you are in the world, count 5 minutes from now, and we will see you here. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to pause the recording. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope that you had a good break. I will invite you to stretch a little bit, stretch your arms. If you need to stand, if you need to move your head, that's also part of system thinking, taking care of the feedback loops of our body, which are telling us, we're been sitting for a very long time. Okay, so we are all back. And I think that we can start accepting more general questions, but I would like to share some of my insights and also share that Felicia and we are going to be offering a more long-term course through an organization that is called Gaia Education, where you will be able to actually explore very different case studies, very different concepts, and apply systems in a deeper way. We're going to be announcing that after this webinar, and we're going to provide some links for you to express interest. So with that, I also want to make some connections with the work of Reconnects and ask you, Felicia, to explain a little bit more some of the concepts that you have presented at the beginning. One of the concepts that you presented were these three, let's say, layers, of the cake of systems. Can you expand a little bit with examples about, for example, what it is, the charitable approach, give some examples of what exists right now in organizations, in social structures, in general systems, what would be that approach?
For sure. So let's see, if we think about that charitable, the top layer of the cake, as it were, in reality, you could take the whole thing and flip it upside down and make the largest layer charitable. Because if you look at the sheer number of NGOs out there, I would say probably most of them tend toward that direct service approach. Now, that might be availability bias because they tend to also be more visible. I have this general sense that the advocacy level, there's also a good number of those type of NGOs or efforts, but that there's more of this. If you're going to start a nonprofit to open a soup kitchen, you're going to start a nonprofit to get feral animals off the street and get them homes. You're going to start a nonprofit to provide tutoring. You're going to start a nonprofit. It's like there's all these different nonprofit or NGO or even just community groups that are unincorporated efforts to try to make the world a better place, to make your neighborhood a better place, to help support, do any number of things. And then with regard to advocacy, and also I'll just mention about the charitable piece is that it tends to be like right now. Like there's like the salamanders on the road, or there's this direct intervention right now sort of time frame.
So just to intervene there, so they are important, like you say, because it's a right now intervention that if we can put that together with, one of the dimensions of the great turning in the world of Reconnects is when we stop the damage. We stop the damage or prevent the damage to go further. So that would be that category of, fast intervention. The way that we can create more connections and be more systemic about that charitable approach is actually not working in isolation. So putting all these charitable approaches together, more when we can see the connection. And maybe the connection could be bioregional. So different solutions for hunger and poverty and animals, but all happening in one particular bioregion, then come together and they will find more systemic solutions. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and that lack of coming together, that there's so many reasons for that. And they stem from the interpersonal to the, IRS codes. There's just, and philanthropy, unfortunately, the way philanthropy tends to happen is, if I'm a donor, I really want to feel good about my money supporting making a difference. And the more tangible and specific that is, the more I'm going to feel like I made a difference. But unfortunately, what that means is that bottom layer of the cake, the systems world, it's very hard to fund an NGO that exists in that space because there's no meals served. There's no even letters written necessarily. There's no sort of linear checkbox annual report style outcomes that you can point to. And so I actually, as part of Systems Thinking Marin, which existed from 2017 to 2022, and still is just kind of wrapping up right now, I supported 2 community groups in Marin County who were a little bit nonprofits, but not really, like kind of had fiscal sponsors on and off, but not really. And they were 2 elders in the Marin City community who they just made sure their meeting happened every month. That was what they could do. And they did it for years and years. And in fact, one person is still doing that. If anybody's in Marin County, Soji and Ricardo Moncrief, he's just made sure that meeting happens every month for years. That's hard to fund. Or at least it has been in the past. Maybe things are shifting, but in any case, just creating a space for people to get together and talk. That's a systems approach. And but again, it's like it's like that that how do we see, like what you just said, Sylvia, about like, well, what about this organization? Couldn't it work with that organization? Like I've seen Ricardo and over just say like, oh, I want you to talk to you, you know, oh, I'm glad you're here because I really want you to hook up with that person. Like that interweaving and that sharing of strategy. But again, when it comes to the world of philanthropy or funding from a local government entity or whatever it might be, the structure is linear. The structure requires you to be isolated. And I know philanthropy is trying to shift and create more of like shared granting and all these sorts of things, but still very difficult. The system facilitates acting in isolation.
Yeah.
Both,
So maybe,
you know, as
maybe
an organization
the approach,
and at the issue level.
yeah, maybe the approach is even further than that, and you know, and trying to see ways of working outside of that box of, you know, how charities work, and also remembering that, you know, we are talking about different systems in different parts of the world, so maybe in other countries, in other cultures, you know, maybe more ability to work together in that way. So moving with examples, and before we invite the questions, can you provide some examples of advocacy? So the advocacy level, you know, more specifically, what kind of organizations, what kind of systemic groups, you know, are out there that you're aware of that could be an example of, you know, advocacy?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different types of advocacy. You know, one version, I should mention the Systems Thinking mini course on the systemsthinkingmarin.org website. It's a 30-minute course total, and I give some more examples in there. So I'm trying to not duplicate those examples in case anybody does or has looked at that. But you know,
or maybe you can talk more generically, like advocacy would be more groups that dedicate themselves to change policies and change, you know, rules, and maybe education, right?
Well, like even in our exercise in our breakout groups, when I was speaking with Jerry, you know, she was saying an example of advocacy is, you know, you post on Nextdoor, please watch out for the animals. Like that's a very simple level of advocacy, talking to your neighbors. I did that when I lived in the San Geronimo Valley in Marin County, where I was doing some research and found a video that's unlisted on YouTube. So you can't like search for it, from the state parks. I think it was state parks. And it was a whole like 20-minute expose on like how and why deer can't see you coming, because their eyes are on the side of their head and the lights, and you know, that whole deer in the headlights thing. Like they explained the physiology of the deer in the headlights phenomena, and the fact that in the fall, in the mating season, they are not looking for cars, they're looking for mates. And so that adds this other level of distraction and just not attending to the safety of themselves on the road. And so this advocacy piece could be as simple as what I did, which was just in the fall, I would send that out to the local list and say, check out this video. It helps you understand how and why you need to slow down, people. And then another level of advocacy is the fact that they made the video, you know, and so even though it's unlisted, it's still out there, and they could send it to people like me who actively, and you know, put ourselves out there to say, hey, help. We need more knowledge. We need more resources. And so does that answer your question?
Yeah. And I was also trying to connect that with, you know, another one of the, you know, in the Great Turn in 3 dimensions, one of the dimensions is the one that I mentioned before, that was, you know, stopping. The other one is actually about analyzing what is happening, you know, looking at what is wrong, what is, you know, what needs to change, and also building new structures, which is partially advocacy overlapping the system, right? And then the other one is the complete shift, you know, in the ways that we think. So the change in overview, in worldview or paradigm. And is, you know, in the work that Reconnects, we do that a lot through different practices. For example, the extending from short-term to long-term, we do with exercises where we project ourselves in the future, into the future, and even into the past, to see the implications of something that we do now. You know, what are the implications to the past and to the future? Or, for example, the shallow to deep, you know, we do that with many practices that go into expanding the relationships, with others, and understanding the deep connection that we have, with all the other beings and things in the universe. So there is a lot of overlapping. I just wanted to bring that, that connection of the word that reconnects and systems thinking. Where is that? And there's so many other connections that we will explore. Well, thank you for that summary of that first piece. And now I would like to open up to questions, not necessarily about the first exercise, but about your presentation or about systems in general. And I would like to see, yeah,
Sylvia, just real quick, I was thinking I would just share my last 2 slides before we go to questions.
Oh, right.
Just
yeah,
to help kind
ahead.
of set it up a little bit.
Perfect.
So
yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to just recapitulate what we covered. So we have this ABC, which Sylvia was also just speaking to, which just stands for that shifting your default perspective. So that was from short to longer term, from narrow to wide, and from surface or shallow to deep. I also brought in this piece in this presentation of noticing your subtle interior response, which we did with the images exercise. And then of course we have the 3-tier model. And then other than that, I just wanted to say thank you. I know we're continuing with Q&A and give you the website. Now I put this FeliciaChavez.com, but actually I should have put systemsthinkingmarin.org up there, and I'll put that in the chat. And finally, as I stop sharing here, I'll just mention that I almost have out a book that's self-published called Dear Marin, where I'm looking at the first 6 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals of 2030 in the context of Marin with a systems thinking perspective. And I'll put a link in the chat. I think it'll be about March 5th or so that it's actually really available. I'm in the waiting for the final proof. Hopefully it's the final proof in the mail. And I published it through Lulu because they're a B corporation from what I understand. But in any case, I just wanted to mention that before I forget.
Thank
So,
you. Yeah,
thank you.
and we're gonna send a lot of resources and next steps for everybody who have registered to this. So thank you for that, Felicia. So questions or anything that you want to ask about the first presentation, about systems in general. And I see Harriet. Harriet, go ahead.
Interesting what you've just been talking about. If you live in Marin County, Felicia, you might know about the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which works on expanding consciousness and the evolution of consciousness, because all of these issues are relating to how we see the world. And as you said, Sylvia, it's as we begin to see the interconnectedness of things, we begin to feel empathy with the animals, and we want to drive so that we don't hit them, and so that we know that deers can't see because of the way their eyes. But as we expand human consciousness, we can begin to deal with the problems with animals as well as the problems with poverty, because as we begin to open ourselves to empathize with the homeless people that live in Marin and Oakland and the people who don't have enough food to eat, we begin to change our lifestyle to live with more empathetic rapport with the people that we're with. So I'd say that it's a crisis of perception, as Fritjof Capra would say, and that as we elevate our consciousness by educating ourselves by things like this, we begin to interact with other beings in a more interdependent and loving way.
Yeah, and with regard to ions, I actually just signed up for their lucid dreaming workshop. I've never really focused on that, but yeah, another for sure.
Helena's a wonderful teacher. You'll enjoy working with her. She's very good.
Thank you, Harriet. It occurs to me, because we're naming some authors and some approaches. Felicia, one thing that, sometimes when people start exploring systems, they don't know where to start. And there are many authors out there who have been doing a lot on, around system. So what would you say is the main difference, or maybe not necessarily the main difference, but if you can name it, that will be great. But maybe where to start. For example, there is Donella Meadows, that she's kind of the the goddess of the systems. And then you have Otto Schammer, with the theory of you, and then you have Fritjof Capra, and then you have Joanna Macy, obviously, for the work the Reconnects, and those are different approaches in different ways, but they're all about systems. Would you add something about that?
Yeah, so I think somebody might already put this in the chat, but I'm putting the link to the systems thinking mini course, and the third video, how can I learn more about systems thinking, which is about 8.5 minutes, has some suggestions that are, a little bit more specific. So basically you're asking like where to go to learn more, and was that your main question?
Yes, and also what would you say are the differences in approaches? So for example, if I read Donella Meadows, what I'm going to get from there if I'm an activist, or should I go more to I don't know, Fritjof Capra course? So what are the approaches differences?
Yes. Well, I'm putting the link to, if you wanted like the whole Donella Meadows thing, you go to academyforsystemschange.org, which subsumed the Donella Meadows Institute at some point. So they've got a lot of resources. I just put a link in the chat to just kind of an intro on my website where I link to some pieces, and including some University of Michigan lectures that she did in the 90s, I think it was. So yeah, the differentiation in terms of difference is really important. For me, it took years to emerge. Like what is this systems thing really? And what does it have to do with game theory and, all these fancy things or not? And for me, I do tend to more occupy this space of organizational development and, community organizing. And I haven't spent a lot of time in like the world of systems theory and dynamics, complexity theory, and all the sort of more scientific-y sort of world. And then in terms of the differences, I would say one caveat. So if we take each of those 3 layers of the cake, the charitable, the advocacy, and the systems, and when they're separate, charitable approaches get into trouble when they don't look at the larger picture. Advocacy programs get into trouble when they don't look at the larger picture. Well, systems get into trouble when we get together in cafes and talk about how the rest of the world fails to be systems thinkers, and then we go back to our linear jobs and lives, and that's it. And I've had that experience again and again and again over time, across workshops, across, like to actually bring it into practice, that's the rub. And now some of us, like me, we're heady, we're intellectuals, we're academics. We like to talk, we like to theorize, we like the models, we like the jargon, all of that. Other people are much more practical. They don't really need the models, or if they need it a little bit, that's fine, but they're really focused much more on where the rubber hits the road, or the, whatever the metaphor is. And so part of the answer to your question is, it is more about your personal orientation and interest. And so if you're more in the systems doing, and that's where you're happy, then that's where taking a permaculture course, or learning about high quality project-based learning, or looking up, empowering women and girls, or restorative justice, or maybe something else you're familiar with that you think might be kind of a systemsy approach to making the world a better place, and you're not quite sure, but that doing piece, leaning into that, that's like, for me, I was interested in permaculture, but it was only a couple years ago that I finally did a course and really kind of got, in the dirt experience. Of course, then COVID hit and we had to go online. My permaculture course was 50% on the computer. But nevertheless, that's kind of the doing piece of it. So is that starting to answer your question a little bit?
No, for sure. Yeah, I wanted to that differentiation to go out to people, like you say, some people need the heady, the models, the vocabulary, and understanding that before they actually apply that to what they are doing. And some people are more let's do this, right? My perception, is that the things like permaculture, I'm also a permaculture teacher, so it's actually you understand the systemic view by actually doing the things. right? So while the other ones are more about studying how that works, and for me has been going from the practical to the more, intellectual part. And when I go to intellectual, I say, oh, now I make the connection, right? At the intellectual level. So thank you for sharing that, because that also goes with, the three dimensions of the great turning of the word, the reconnect. So people who are more into the practical side of building things that are the new system, which is one of the things that Donella Meadows says, when you go and create a paradigm, you continually speak about the new paradigm. In this case is the great turning, and you actually create a great turning. So at one point, the other system is going to become obsolete. And, also the other one, which you were talking about at the beginning, when you say, we sit, in cafes, discuss about how others don't apply system, and then you go to your work and you don't apply system. It reminds me one of the higher levels, which is, transcending paradigms, which is accepting. It has to be all with connection, surrendering, allowing for emergence, and understanding that no paradigm is right or wrong. It all depends on, what the system that you are applying that to, or, the circumstances that you have around. I would like to invite more questions. We do have about 10 minutes left, for questions, insights. I would like to see the people. I don't know. You can actually go to reactions, and that's a way for you to raise your hand.
Yeah, and I'll just mention, I saw somebody mentioned Braiding Sweetgrass. That's a great, beautiful book. And it makes me think also of another book that's a bit more on the academic side. It's very large. It's called Tending the Wild by M. Cat Anderson, and it's specifically about the Native peoples of California. And I found it really, really very illuminating. So much documentation and research in that book.
Thank you. And that also brings, the concept, or more than the concept, the reality that indigenous people are system thinkers by nature, by default. I see two hands. Felipe, go ahead.
Thank you. Felicia, thank you for this session, and also Sylvia and all the participants. And my question is, I would like to know if you have a way to identify or define the boundaries when you are exploring systems. Because in my case, when I've been trying to do that, the emergencies start appearing, and suddenly I just lose myself into the system, and suddenly I don't know where I am. So I would like to know if you have some suggestions about that. It was clear?
Yeah, for sure. In fact, what you ask about brings up that phrase, paralysis by analysis, which can apply, strangely enough, to the world of systems too. And it goes back to that idea of just talking about systems rather than that, really applying. And one little piece I reference from Donella Meadows again is she talks about making a systems map. And the link I put in the chat to her Michigan lectures, underneath that, there's Dartmouth lectures, and it's in black and white. And I think it's in that series of talks where she mentions that it's really easy to kind of go overboard with your systems maps when you're actually making a systems map, thinking you have to include absolutely every last possible thing. And really, it's something like with 20% of the elements, you get like 80% of the value. And another piece just related to that is that, I've looked at other systems maps that other people have created over time, and I often kind of like, it doesn't click. I don't really get it. And at some point she says something somewhere, it might be in the same series of lectures, that a systems map is really meant to be something you do for your purposes in your particular period of time, knowing that the moment you do it, something has shifted and it's old news a little bit. But for your purposes, it might be okay. And then you redo it again, and then you redo it again. So it's meant to be iterative. It's meant to be over time. I know you didn't ask about maps specifically, but it kind of relates to that, where do you draw the boundaries? And so I think that piece of just start somewhere back of the napkin, drawing out a few pieces, just that is going to help. Oh, like maybe maybe I didn't think about that, you know, and then of course this principle of diversity of input from as many players in as different places as possible. I really learned that from Bruce McKenzie and his systemics with this, like, you know, you want to talk to the person who mops the floor, and you want to talk to the person who assists the person at the top, and you want to talk to everybody in between and beyond, and the customers kids, you know, like whatever the diversity is. But also you do need to, you know, not fall into the paralysis by analysis piece. You know, there does need to be a time when you say enough, and then that's where iteration comes in, where you go through another round of the input, the understanding, and then the, you know, let's try this out, and then you try the thing out and you go back again. So it's this cyclical process, so that you don't feel like you have to do it perfect. You know, I know in my dissertation, I had a chapter on purity and perfection, and it really kind of came to the conclusion, based on mostly mystical literature, that we really, really need that archetype of perfection and purity as a reference. And never, ever, ever here on Earth is anything perfect or pure. It doesn't exist. Not water, not gold. It's never pure. So I hope that helps with your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you a lot.
Yeah, I will add to that, you know, that there's always the circle of concern and the circle of impact. So you had to have a balance between the two of those. You know, what you may be concerned about, you know, I don't know, poverty in the world, and that's too big. And then what is the actual impact that you can do with the resources that you have, and the time, you know, and the energy that you have and your group has. And the other thing is, you know, and one way that in my particular case has worked a lot is to create that map that Felicia was mentioning. You know, having that the boundaries of that system as bioregional. So that's what you can bring together easily, because they are close. You know, they are connected by a bioregion. They are connected by an ecosystem. You know, similar things, similar patterns that are happening. So that is a way to solve many different problems in one particular place. And to connect with that place easily than if you are trying to solve something, you know, on the other side of the world. Just answering to and adding to what Felicia said. Thank you, Felipe. And I have Barbara.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, Felicia. This is wonderful to meet you all, and so great to see so many people interested in this topic. And I'm a practitioner and also a writer, but I'm really curious about your experience when you're working with communities that are not used to deal with, you know, the system mindset and system perspective. And I'm curious to hear from you, what have you experienced, have clicked, had shifted the perspective? And I know there are many, many ways, but it's always interesting to exchange the ideas and practices, what actually makes people shift, because I've experienced in some environments, it's extraordinarily difficult to change the patterns and mindset, and sometimes it's much easier. And I'm very interested in what makes it click, what makes this shift happen. Maybe you share a few examples that were particularly inspiring to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. And Felicia, I will give you the time, but something that you said that you wrote the book about, and we work also in Gaia Education, is with the sustainable goals that, you know, are very criticized for many different reasons. But one of the things that the group did was to put these sustainable goals in a collection of cards where they actually interconnect. So we actually have a whole book and a training for people who want to go and work with communities. You bring these cards and you present these cards, and maybe the community comes to you. I don't know, maybe it's the, you know, the local government, and they have a problem on drugs, you know, teens with drugs, and that's their problem. That's what they want to address. Or they may have another problem of homelessness. So you present these cards and you start a game of interaction where they can see how the things are connected. So it's kind of physical, you know, the way that you connect, instead of telling them how these things connect, they actually can see through the questions and the games how these things connect. So that has been my experience and my approach when I have worked. You know, I work, you know, in the past I worked with immigrants and also with mostly with food and the issue of food, you know, what we call food sovereignty. The word was gone in the Spanish, you know, food sovereignty here in where I live. So the connection was food. Actually, that's one of the main connectors when you bring people for a potluck and everybody brings their, you know, the meals from the countries or the culture of their families. And that is, you know, explodes in a lot of conversation. You connect people. So that's the first start. You're not talking about systems, but you are doing the connection already. And then you start playing these games with them. It could be through these cards, could be through any other thing that is more into the more playful approach. But I would like to see you, Felicia, what has been your experience with connecting those?
Yeah, so thank you for the question, Barbara. There's no easy answer here. It's very much a challenge. And I want to just highlight that sort of impulse to get them to understand. Like even that is a bit of a linear thing that we all get kind of caught in. What I have found, and I'm sure you, Barbara, in your experience too, have seen this, is that very quickly the tables are turned and you find yourself the student. Especially in those arenas of particularly, you know, groups of people that are not our own, groups of people we didn't grow up with, who we don't have close friends in or with, or, you know, that are new to us in some way, shape, or form, maybe a different culture or what have you. And so very quickly becoming the student is kind of like the first thing. And then as you are the student, as you are listening and learning and having exchanges, things start to surface. And, you know, it's going to be different, obviously, from community to community. One of the things that I've gone to again and again is just, again, this piece about relationships. And so with what Sylvia was just sharing, it's a relationship between people and food, and the relationships between people that's sparked by food, and the relationships between all kinds of different groups that's sparked by talking about and addressing the food system. And I find that people, you know, especially people who care about their community, and even if they themselves are really caught in difficult circumstances, nevertheless care and have demonstrated that they care through their volunteer work or through just helping somebody out, just helping out their neighbors. Like there's all kinds of these different ways that we demonstrate care. And I'm putting a link to a blog entry about the book Radical Help by Hillary Cottam, which has to do with social systems. It's an amazing book. And she uses the phrase systems thinking like once in her entire book. But from my perspective, what she's doing is absolutely full on a systems approach. And again, it starts with this listening and building relationships. And that's like the thing you go to. And, you know, what, like if I suddenly found myself in South Africa looking at the baboon issue, like that's the first thing you do is you start to talk to people and learn about, you know, you just listen, you find out. And then, yeah, of course, you know, in complex situations, the systems worldview is very much the thing you need to go to. But it's tricky because like our impulse to help is often to fix, and it needs to be kind of backed up more into that, what we were kind of saying earlier of just, you know, improving, contributing something, being willing to hear no, go away, and that has to be okay. But yeah, it's your question is a challenging one, and there's no easy answer.
No, thanks for sharing. I think I'm feeling some of the same, you know, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Felicia. I see Albert, and this is gonna be our last, Albert, our last question. Go ahead, Albert.
In the large system, to be very general or local and very complicated and very easy, is there are a tremendous number of traumatized people in this change process. And any of the linear approaches exclude those people because they're difficult to deal with. And they need to be, they're our neighbors. And so I just include that. I mean, this could be a forever conversation. But the simplest, most systemic way I think that's in front of us is our children, our babies, because that's when we can start curbing, trauma. And we know how to do that. And that seems like the most systems way to deal with the multitude of complexities and so many traumatized people that are bent on changing what we're talking about, and they can't be excluded. They're our neighbors. So I guess that's enough. Thank you for that end.
Yes, thank you, Albert. And, you know, from my perspective, we're a traumatized society, if not species. I don't want to say species because I don't know enough about indigenous cultures around the world to say for sure, but certainly in terms of the sort of European migrated to North America, the level of trauma is extreme and profound and just beneath the surface. So yes, there's particular groups that right now exhibit behaviors that are especially challenging, problematic, a real freaking drag for everybody that are on the surface. But you go into any organization and it takes very little time before you hit people's stuff that's personal to them, that's from their family, that's from their ethnic group, or that's just from society that they've picked up and they're carrying, and that I've picked up, I'm carrying, we've picked up and we're carrying. I mean, if we look at the history of the kings of England, you know, as a common example, the level of trauma visited on entire landscapes of people by the monarch over centuries is extreme. And then of course, migrated over to here, to the United States, to the Americas, and, you know, and then of course, this has happened in lots of places in the world as well. So that trauma piece is huge and actually sadly can't be overstated. So for me, it does come back to this relationship piece and how do we up the quality of our interactions, of our relationships, of our just of what's okay and what's not okay. You know, lots of nonprofit organizations have a toxic culture. And if it's not toxic, it's just not great, you know, and that's kind of okay right now. And it needs to be not okay. We need to sort of pull that out of the closet, put the situation on the table so we can look at it and attend to it thoughtfully. And that's just an outcome of the system, you know, nonprofits being sort of the little cousin of the capitalist system, a convenient little IRS category that we're sort of forced into and try to adhere to, try to do our best. We're well-meaning. But yeah, that trauma piece is huge. I really like, of course, Gabor Mate and, you know, his book In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And, you know, there's a lot of work that's phenomenal about the world of trauma. And you kind of move into those waters, into that book, into the film, and start to kind of develop that empathy for the wider, not just other individuals that you might encounter on the street or friends of friends at a party or your work or whatever it might be, but that larger sense of like, we're challenged.
Thank you. Thank you for that important question, Albert and Felicia. And there are so many tools to work with that. I just posted one, which is the art of hosting. It's not necessarily about trauma, but it's about how to bring people together and navigate, you know, the different challenges of putting people who may not be directly connected because they have opposite worldviews, but how to bring them together to work together towards a common goal. So we are at the end of the webinar. This has been really rich. Thank you, Felicia, for being here. We're going to follow up with the recording, some of the resources that have been named, some courses and books that you can, you know, take to explore further. We may even have a cafe. Sometimes we, you know, in the network, we have a cafe following up network webinars that are really, really rich, where people want to continue the conversation. We will let you know. So, Joe, do you have anything to add?
Just the closing, if you want to do that.
Yeah. Okay. So go ahead. Let's go ahead with the closing. And I don't know if you want to share because I'm in spotlight right now. I don't see how to do that.
I'll just post a thing in the chat there, but you
Oh,
can.
perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm gonna just share a screen here to say thank you to everybody. Thank you for attending, and you will see all the information about the network in the chat. You will receive feedback survey to let us know how we did. And we invite you to come to the next webinar that is going to be actually about shifting paradigms, one of the biggest points to intervene in a system. So thank you.
Thank you so much.